So Cuba is collapsing. And I don't mean economically struggling. I mean airlines gone, hotels shuttered, payment systems broken, hospitals fighting blackouts, and patients waiting for treatments that cannot keep getting delayed. The country is being squeezed until it can't breathe.
And here's the thing. The United States didn't have to fire a shot. They didn't send troops, didn't launch a single missile. They didn't have to.
Nope, they just made doing business with Cuba feel dangerous. And that's the whole weapon. Fear. Not laws, fear. And when you see how effectively they just used that weapon on Cuba, the question isn't whether they'll use it again. The question is, who's next?
And if you're Canadian, you're not going to like the answer.
All right, let's walk through what actually happened here because the media coverage has been, well, how do I say it politely, missing the machinery entirely. Cuba's blackouts aren't a natural disaster. They're not bad governance in a vacuum. The Trump administration put an energy blockade in place. Ships carrying oil to Cuba were turned away. Shipping companies terrified of touching anything that might get them flagged by the U.S. Treasury.
And this is where people get confused. They think sanctions mean America won't trade with you. But that's not what happened here. What happened here is way more aggressive. It's called secondary sanctions. The U.S. tells companies outside its borders, European shipping firms, Asian banks, Canadian airlines, if you do business with Cuba, we will punish you. We'll cut you off from U.S. banking systems. We'll freeze your assets. We'll drag you into a legal nightmare that costs more than any Cuban contract is worth.
Right, and here's the part that should make every Canadian exporter stop and actually think. These companies weren't breaking any law. WestJet wasn't violating Canadian law flying to Cuba. Sunwing was operating legally under Canadian regulations. Air Canada, Air Transat, all of them completely legal under our system. But it didn't matter.
Because the U.S. wasn't prosecuting them for breaking a law, they were threatening them for ignoring a preference. And in a world where the U.S. dollar and the U.S. banking system sit at the center of everything, that threat is bigger than any single transaction.
And to be clear here, the airlines and hotels are not leaving for one single reason. They're leaving because the whole operating environment is breaking down.
You've got fuel shortages, blackouts, fewer travelers, payment systems under pressure, insurance and banking risk, and sitting underneath all of it, U.S. sanctions making every part of doing business in Cuba harder.
So no. It's not as simple as saying one executive order caused every company to leave overnight.
But it's also not honest to pretend that this is just normal market forces.
Yeah, the sanctions helped create the conditions. The conditions crushed tourism. And once tourism collapses, then the airlines and the hotels follow.
And that's the chain reaction that Canadians need to understand.
So one by one, they all pulled out. The airlines, gone. The hotels got shuttered. Visa and Mastercard suspended. The payment systems just stopped working. And when payment systems break in a modern economy, everything else follows.
Fuel delivery, food shipments, medical supplies. It's not a blockade with ships, it's a blockade with compliance departments.
And now you've got hospitals running blackouts. Cancer patients missing treatments. Dialysis patients waiting. Ordinary Cubans who had nothing to do with any geopolitical chess game, they're the ones paying the price.
Okay, so here's the thing that Canadians need to pay attention to, because what just happened to Cuba is not a one-off. It's not an isolated foreign policy decision about a small island. It's a demonstration, a live-fire exercise in economic coercion, and Canada is watching from the front row.
So let's connect the dots here. This will help. The same administration that just strangled Cuba's economy until it collapsed is the same administration that's got Canada in the trade war. The same people who made the airlines choose between their business and the U.S. Treasury's good graces are the same people telling Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian auto parts that you better fall in line.
And here's what we keep coming back to. The weapon works the same way. You don't need to win a trade negotiation. You don't need to prove anything in a tribunal. You just need to make enough noise, enough legal threats, enough tariff uncertainty, and supply chain disruption that private companies start pulling back on their own.
And that's already happening. We've seen it. We're seeing it now. Canadian buyers hesitating, investors pausing, contracts getting reviewed by nervous legal departments. Banks, they're even getting cautious about cross-border exposure. It's not the tariffs themselves doing all this damage. It's the uncertainty. The fear that whatever you build today, the rules, they could change tomorrow.
And the Cubans will tell you, once that fear sets in, once the private sector starts treating your country like a risk instead of a market, it doesn't matter what your government says. The machinery is already in motion and the wheels are already turning.
Now, I do want to be really careful here because Canada, it's not Cuba. Our economy is not their economy. Our institutions are not their institutions. Nobody is saying the situations are identical, but it's the tool that's the same. Economic fear as a weapon. And you don't need a perfect comparison to see the warning label and the writing on the wall.
So let's see an example. Softwood lumber. The U.S. has been beating Canada on that file for decades. Steel and aluminum. Tariffs went up. Exemptions came and went. And now we're back in the uncertainty zone. Auto manufacturing, which is deeply integrated supply chains that cross the border multiple times before a car is finished. And then you have energy. Every single one of those sectors depend on predictable access to the U.S. markets. And what Cuba is showing us is that predictable access can become unpredictable overnight. Not because of a law that was passed, but because of a phone call, a press conference, and a Truth Social post at 2 a.m.
And when that uncertainty hits, companies don't wait for their government to negotiate a solution. Nope. They hedge, they diversify, and they pull back. And the economy bleeds. Not from a formal sanction, but from 1,000 private decisions made in boardrooms that are suddenly very nervous about their U.S. exposure.
And that's the chilling effect. Cubans are feeling it now, and we're starting to feel it around the edges.
So what does Canada do? Because this is the part where these videos usually turn into a lecture about diversifying trade, and then we all go back to just checking the news and moving on with our lives. But I think the Cuba example actually gives us something even more concrete.
The countries that survive economic coercion are the ones that build real alternatives before the pressure arrives, not after. We're already doing it with Europe. The defense partnerships with Germany and Norway, the Sweden AWACS deal, the new trade routes opening up, those aren't just nice headlines, they're insurance policies.
Yeah, and India, they just sent one of their largest trade delegations in history to Canada. That didn't happen by accident. They looked at the global landscape and made a choice. Indonesia, 280 million people, a massive growing economy. Canada has a trade deal there now. The UAE committed $70 billion in investment. There's many, many examples of how this is going.
Now, these aren't symbolic either. They are real supply chains, real contracts, real alternatives putting everything through one border crossing. And the Canada that walks into the next round of this trade war with options is not the same Canada that walked into the last round hoping for goodwill.
Yeah, the goodwill era, that is long gone. And honestly, maybe that's not a bad thing. Because goodwill, that never really was a strategy. It was just a prayer that the other guy wouldn't wake up in a bad mood.
So the media is ignoring what is happening in Cuba. People are dying. People are running out of options. People are running out of electricity, food, water, and medical assistance. And we need to keep paying attention. For one, it's the right thing to do. For another, it could happen anywhere.
So we have a question for you guys today. Do you believe that Canada is building alternatives fast enough? Or are we still hoping that the relationship goes back to normal while the machinery that collapsed Cuba is already pointing right in our direction?
And I have a second question. If the U.S. did to the Canadian sector what they just did in Cuba, do you think anyone would have our backs? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'd really like to know.
So if this resonated with you today, share it, like it, hype it, and get it out there because we really need to be talking about what's happening in Cuba.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we shall see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.